You are listening to the Our View podcast, where we aim to educate, raise awareness, and change the tone of conversation about disabilities. Every week, we bring you episodes that are centered around topics related to disabilities. As the host, it is my hope that you are not just inspired by these stories that are shared, but that you put some action behind your inspiration to do something that improves the lives of those who live with disabilities. I thank you, our loyal listeners, for your support and remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Our View for Life and to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts to tell us what you enjoy most about the podcast. Let's get into this conversation. I would like to welcome everyone back to another episode of the Our View podcast, where we aim to educate, raise awareness, and change the tone of conversation about disabilities. I am happy to welcome my guest on today's show, Natasha D'Arcangelo, to the podcast. So thank you so much for joining me today, Natasha. I am happy to have you here.
And I am excited to be here.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do, and something fun that you like to do that you enjoy?
Sure. So I am a licensed mental health counselor. I am licensed in Florida, in Washington, and in Oregon. So I see folks that live in those three states. I am currently working full time for Headspace Health and really specialize in trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. Work with a lot of folks with anxiety. That's another really common one. And then I do public speaking on the side. So I am really passionate about trying to destigmatize all concepts around mental health. I think it's a shame that there's so much secrecy around mental health and in a lot of circles, people think that it's not okay to go see a therapist. And so I'm always looking to bring awareness to it's okay to not be okay. And if you had something going on with your heart, you wouldn't hesitate to go see a cardiologist. So, this is the same thing. If you have something going on emotionally, there shouldn't be a reason for you to hesitate to go see a professional. Our profession exists for a reason, and always looking to try to normalize things for people. I also take pride in being a BIPOC clinician. So, according to the American Counseling Association, as of last year, only about 30% of licensed professional counselors across the country identified under the BIPOC umbrella, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And that's a low number. We need to do better as a field. But I also really want to get my face out there so that folks know that there are therapists that look like me. I'm first generation American, proud child of immigrant parents. That is a core part of my identity. And so also really like working with first gen clients. And I would say a fun thing about me is she's sleeping now, but she is up here with me. I have an office assistant. Her name is Celeste, and she is a real life therapy dog. And we get to go do visits out in the community, and we go to schools and the university and hospitals. And I absolutely love it. And she is a better therapist than I will ever be. And I know that. So, yeah.
Yes, I am. I'm so happy that you're here to talk on topics related to mental health. As I shared with you earlier, and as I've shared before on the podcast, I did major in psychology, and so mental health and topics related to mental health are very important to me, and it's important that I share these conversations on the podcast as well, because they are diagnoses are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's really it falls into my raising awareness and changing the tone of conversation about disabilities mission. So
Yeah.
I'm very excited, and I was also happy that you did mention that you are a BIPOC uh, counselor, because, as you said, the number is so low for people who
Yeah.
identify as being BIPOC
Yeah.
in the counseling field, and that was another reason why I majored in psychology, because at the time, um, I had been to a few counselors myself, and none of them
Mhm.
looked like me.
Right. And it
you
makes a
know, it
difference.
does, it
Yeah.
does, and
Yeah.
so I also know a lot of times in our community, I'm African American. We don't talk about our feelings too much too often.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so so that makes it a lot. I think it may make it a lot more difficult for BIPOC people to reach out to a therapist if they don't see somebody who looks like them, because they feel like they may not be able
Absolutely.
to identify with what they're dealing with, and what they're feeling and all of that. So I'm very
Yeah.
excited to have this conversation with you today. So, as you mentioned, you are a licensed mental health counselor. And can you share with us a little bit more about the clients, the population whom you serve?
Sure. So, right now, I'm working primarily with adolescents and adults. I am a former educator, so I was a teacher once upon a time.
Cool.
Most therapists fall into one of two camps. They either work with children and adolescents or they work with adults. I'm kind of weird because I will see children as young as 5, and then go up from there. But that's because again, I was a teacher once upon a time, so I don't mind working with younger children. So primarily, I see folks who are in some kind of transition. So maybe they're really unhappy with their job, but they're not quite sure what to do. There's something going on in their relationship. A lot of times folks will come to me in the aftermath of grief. So maybe
Hmm.
they've just recently lost somebody. They're looking for a place to process through that. What almost always happens is people like a thing will happen and people are like, okay, well, that was hard, but I can deal with it. And then another thing will happen. And they're like, okay, okay, I can deal with that. And then another thing happens, and then it just feels like everything in your brain short circuits. And so oftentimes that is how folks will present to me. And almost always they come to me in this there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. I'm defective. Why can't I get over whatever it is that's happened to me? Why am I dealing with this so poorly? And so a lot of what I try to do is normalize well, you're human. And had it been just the one thing, you probably would have been just fine. But after the 10th thing happened, you just your system got overwhelmed, and that happens. It happens to all of us. Now what pushes us to that point of overwhelm is different for every person,
Hmm.
but it's really not fair to you to be beating yourself up for that. So every therapist has a different approach. Every therapist has a different modality. We have to complete a 60 credit master's degree in order to be able to do counseling. And so there's standard courses that we take. We take, substance abuse, we take trauma, we take, diagnosis, treatment planning, all of that stuff. But after graduation, we have to start collecting continuing education units. And oftentimes that's where we'll find our specialization.
Hmm.
I have decided to specialize in trauma. I would not have predicted for myself had you talked to graduate level me, but I love it. I really love working with folks that have a history of trauma because it's so gratifying for me to see them live a higher quality of life. And
Hmm.
so the approach that I tend to take when I'm in session is to use my trauma training background, which accidentally also helps my folks struggling with anxiety. Was not the original reason that I did that training, but there's a lot of neuroscience and understanding your own brain better and how it works
Wow.
that helps the folks that I work with that have anxiety. So that's my typical approach. I do also use some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, kind of challenging. A lot of times people will come to me with, I'm no good at anything. Everything I try just fails. And I'm like, well, that can't possibly be true. You could not possibly have failed at every single thing, right? And so the fancy therapy word for that is a cognitive distortion.
Hmm.
And so through cognitive behavioral therapy, we start to challenge some of those thoughts. and recognize that you may be overwhelmed in the moment, but that doesn't mean that you literally failed at everything that you've tried in your entire life. So in therapy speak, I have an eclectic approach. I kind of pull from my different trainings to see what's going to benefit the client that's sitting in front of me or
Hmm.
across the computer from me because now I'm fully remote. And really try to personalize it to what my clients are presenting to me with. So another note on therapy: every therapist does things differently.
Hmm.
And if you have tried therapy before and you said, this was miserable, this was not for me, I absolutely hated it, I want to equate that to, we've all been to a doctor at some point that had horrible bedside manner,
Hmm.
right? My dermatologist will never see him again. I will see the physician's assistant. I will not see him. Um, Everybody's had that experience, right? It's the same thing with therapy. You may have had a really horrible experience, but we're not all the same. And oftentimes we have to meet with a couple of different therapists before we really find somebody that we click with. And I promise you, it's worth putting in that investment in the beginning,
Hmm.
because what every single study tells us about therapy, so many studies have been done. Why does therapy work? How do we predict whether or not it's going to work? And they look at, does your therapist have a master's or a doctorate? How many years have they been in practice? What kind of trainings have they done? And what they find is it always comes down to the relationship between the client and the therapist.
Hmm.
So, bottom line, you have to feel comfortable with your therapist. And if that doesn't happen with the first person that you meet with, that's normal.
Hmm.
That's normal. So it is well worth your time to do a little bit of internet searching. When clients tell me that they Googled me before our first session, I'm like, fantastic. That's great. So you already know a little bit about me. But that you want to do that, right? What does your therapist specialize in? Can you do a free consultation call with them? Um, those kinds of things are really, really important. So if you put in that research ahead of time,
Hmm.
it's going to help you kind of essentially weed out the people that are not the best fit for you and makes your life a little bit easier. So yeah.
Yeah, I love what you said. I think a lot of times I can use myself as an example. I don't often pay attention to all of the things that are happening all at once. And then, like you said, it reaches a point where it's just like, oh my gosh, like this is so much. This is so heavy on me. Then it's like, oh
Hmm.
wow, when you break it down, it's like, oh yeah, those five things did happen within those 4 weeks. And it's like, oh wow.
No
And
wonder my brain short circuited.
right. And I also love what you said about you know what short circuits us is different for everybody, where every
Mhm.
person reaches a point where it's like, oh my gosh, this is too much to handle at this point. That's different for everybody. I often I've had conversations with people who, they're having a bad day about something, and then they'll stop and they'll say like, oh, like sorry to vent to you, and with all the stuff that you're dealing with. And I'm like, hey, like,
Mhm.
just because I'm dealing with stuff like what you're going through might have broken me. I don't know.
Sure,
It's
sure.
I've lived with my disability for 41 years. I'm used to the discomfort and the pain that I feel, and sometimes it keeps me in bed. Most of the time, it doesn't. Sometimes
Mhm.
I have to, like, force myself to stay in the house. But it's like you can't compare everybody's struggles. Like, what
Correct. Yes.
what I can get through might have broken you, or vice versa. Like, we just don't know. Um,
Yeah.
so it's definitely okay to, like you said, to seek out that therapy, and it's also okay to say like, you're not the right one for me. It's
And
like,
that's okay,
yeah, that's okay. It's a relationship, just like a friendship, or any type of relationship that you might have. You have to develop all those things, the trust and all of that, to feel comfortable to open up to the therapist. So, yeah, definitely seek out the right one, the right person for you. That's really
Mhm.
really important.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Um, so, in our pre-conversation and messages that we've exchanged, you shared that you were diagnosed with anxiety as a child. Did that have an impact on the path, your career path that you have chosen?
So two answers to that. So I actually was not diagnosed with anxiety as a child.
Oh, okay.
But knowing what I know now, I have had anxiety for like as long as my conscious memory goes
Uh-huh.
back. But the interesting thing is, it did not influence my career decision, and here's why: because I come from a family where we don't talk about mental health stuff.
Mm.
And so, I always say that my grandma genetically gifted me her anxiety. So thanks, grandma. And it's always been this thing in my family where we never called it anxiety. That's just how grandma is. And my
Mm.
family's from Guyana in South America. So, former British colony. So we say that she studies. Grandma studies. We don't even say that she worries. We say that she studies.
Oh.
And it's just always been that's how grandma is, right?
Hmm.
And so there were no conversations around. I mean, I would feel like I needed to throw up before I gave presentations. I remember feeling that in elementary school. I remember
Wow.
having to do school plays and being up there and, like shaking and just wanting to hide under a chair. And I thought it was normal. I thought everybody felt that way. And it really wasn't until I got to college that I realized that not everybody feels that way. That's not a thing that everybody goes through, but it had been so normalized in my family dynamic that even to this day, when I say grandma has anxiety, it makes people upset.
Oh.
So it's still a we don't talk about Bruno. Like grandma
Uh,
studies. She doesn't have anxiety. She studies. That's just how she is, right? And so now knowing what I know, I
hmm.
know that I had anxiety, but because I didn't know that at the time, it didn't influence my career
Right.
decision, which
Wow.
is it's so interesting. The way that I got here is as a former educator, I never felt like I was doing enough for my students. It was so
Mm.
focused on all of the state testing and I I didn't get into teaching to focus on state testing. Ended up moving down to Florida, had an opportunity to, I was working for Argosy University, and they said, well, you can get a free master's degree since you work here. And I said, great. And was going to do school counseling or school psychology, but decided to do clinical mental health counseling so I could work with a wider variety of populations. And here I am. And now I work with adults and I love it. And I never would have predicted that for myself. So, yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it is. It's so interesting though. As you said, as you know what you know, you could look back, and I think I can definitely look back on some things and identify what it was, after the fact now.
Yep.
But yeah, that's really interesting. I wanted to make sure that we touched on that,
Yes.
and to continue the conversation about anxiety, because it's a lot. It's been a lot in the news, especially
Mhm.
the last 3 years, which is so hard to believe that we've
Yes.
been living in this pandemic. And now that things in most places are opening up again, and people are having anxiety about being in
Mhm.
crowded spaces again because
Places.
they've been in the house, or in smaller groups for the majority of the last 3 years. So, can
Yeah.
you share with us what is anxiety? How is it defined? And some of the
Sure.
statistics and prevalence of anxiety, and also some coping strategies that people can maybe use to work through their own anxiety.
Sure. So let's start with the definition of anxiety. So there's a difference between having anxiety and experiencing anxious moments, right?
Hmm.
So if you, for example, are giving a big presentation at work and the entire department is going to be there, it's pretty normal to have butterflies in your stomach and maybe not sleep so well the night before. That's different than having like diagnosable anxiety.
Right.
Diagnosable anxiety, so it falls under the umbrella of, I'm going to go with the most common one. There's obviously subcategories, but generalized anxiety disorder. And so the definition of generalized anxiety disorder is in the DSM. So every
Hmm.
therapist, psychologist, social worker that you know has, it's a pretty serious book.
Yeah.
But this is where the definition comes from, and it goes along with not just the symptoms you're experiencing, but also how long have you been experiencing those symptoms. So it's kind of a twofold thing. So a lot of times people will essentially misdiagnose themselves. There is a, I know that there's mental health TikTok, and I think that there are good things about that, in that it is bringing more awareness to some things that we don't necessarily talk about. But I also think that depending on who your source is, you may not necessarily be getting the most accurate information. So you
Right.
may want to take it with a grain of salt, right? So I wanted to make sure I pulled it up for you. So there's the page on generalized anxiety disorder. Um, and what we're looking for is excessive anxiety and worry occurring more days than not for at least 6 months. So you can't say that you have generalized anxiety disorder because you had to give a presentation at work last week,
Hmm.
right? You haven't been, the way that I describe it is, do you worry about all the things all the time, and you just can't seem to shut it off, right? That's excessive. And even about things that are outside of your control. So a common thing would be, I had a client maybe about a month or so ago who had their performance review coming up and had convinced themselves that their boss was going to fire them. And if their boss fires them, then they're not going to be able to pay their mortgage. And if they don't pay their mortgage, then they're going to end up homeless. And if they end up homeless, then what in the world is going to happen with their dog? Because they don't want their poor dog to be out on the street, and it was just this cascading effect, right? That's excessive worry.
Hmm.
So that's one of the things that we look at. Another really common thing is you have difficulty concentrating. You have feelings of restlessness. So I have clients that pace in session. They just can't sit still. They're always shaking their leg. They're irritable. They seem to be snapping at everybody around them. You're having trouble sleeping because you're laying in bed and the movie is playing in your head of this thing that you said in seventh grade. And why did you do that? That was a stupid thing to do. So those are some of the common markers. Muscle tension is another really big one. So, I have clients where their
Hmm.
shoulders are, up to their ears. So those are some of the common ones, and that's generalized anxiety disorder. So the difference is how severe are the symptoms and how long have they been present. So one of the benchmarks we use for, I'm gonna use fancy therapy phrase, is clinically significant distress. So if it is impacting your marriage because your partner is telling you, I'm watching you pace and it's making me nervous, and can you just sit down, please? Right? Or you're forgetting so many things at work because you're so anxious all the time. That's clinically significant distress. Not the same thing as I was nervous the day before I gave a presentation at work, right?
Hmm.
So that's what we're looking at. How long have symptoms been present and how much are they impacting your life? Now, as far as prevalence goes, I'm really glad you mentioned COVID, because literally today, in preparation for this, I pulled up the most recent statistics from the National Center for Health Statistics, which is run by the CDC. In 2019, as a country and as an average, there's all kinds of subcategories, but generally as a population, 6.5% of adults reported symptoms of anxiety. In December 2022, that number was 29.8%.
Wow.
We went from 6.5 to 29.8%.
Wow.
That's a really significant jump, right?
Mhm.
So the other thing I want you to keep in mind is just like how we were saying, there's different things that will kind of push people to the point of overwhelm. For almost 3 years now, we have all been experiencing a global traumatic event.
Mhm.
COVID has fundamentally changed how we operate in our universes, and it has impacted every single person on this planet. And if you find that you're having a hard time sleeping or you're really struggling to shut your brain off, you're within that 26.9% of people. And that's just in the country, that's not even worldwide, right?
Mhm.
So it would be normal and maybe even expected that you would be worrying a little bit more right now. So, if you go to the National Center for Health Statistics, it's readily available online. You can see they break it down by gender, by education, by ethnic background, all of those things. But they keep it updated fairly regularly. So, it's really interesting to take a look at those statistics. So, very prevalent, very, very
Wow.
prevalent. And our adolescents are the ones struggling the most right now.
Mhm.
It's our teens that are really, really having a hard time. So that's defining anxiety and then talking a little bit about prevalence and statistics. And then as far as coping skills go, a huge thing, especially to learn in therapy. So there's a couple of really quick ones that I like to use with clients. One of them is a grounding technique using your five senses. So if you feel like you are becoming overwhelmed or you're starting to get maybe kind of panicky, you can kind of run through it in your head where you utilize your five senses, look around you, and think about what are five things that I can see right now? What are four things that I can touch or that I currently am touching? What are three things that I can hear, right? What are two things that I can smell? And then what's one thing that I can taste, right? And if you have somebody with you, you can name it out loud for them if that's somebody that you're close with, but it's also a list that you can go through in your head. And what that'll do is that'll help you hopefully come back to the present moment, where you're at and what's actually happening. So that's a simple, five senses grounding technique. Some people find it helpful to, wear like a rubber band on their wrist, and every so often, if they're feeling anxious, they can kind of snap the rubber band. Again, kind of brings them back to the present moment.
Mhm.
The other thing is, and this comes from the trauma training that I've done, your anxiety from a neuroscience perspective comes from some kind of painful past learning. So I want you to think about your brain as a computer. Your brain stores every single piece of information that you have ever encountered for your entire life. You may not consciously be aware of it, but I promise you it's up there. Maybe you witnessed a car accident 5 years ago, and I say to you, what was the license plate of that car? And you say, I have no idea. I don't know what I ate for breakfast yesterday. I have no idea what the license plate of that car was. But if we get somebody qualified to hypnotize you can pull that license plate number out, right? Because it's there. You just need to be able to access it. That is both a blessing and a curse because what happens is as you navigate through your universe from birth, your nervous system is constantly taking in information about your
Mhm.
environmental stimuli and it's putting it into one of two buckets. This will kill you, this will not.
Mm.
Sometimes the things that get put into the this will kill you bucket actually can't kill you. And yet, if you encountered something one time in your life that your nervous system stored in the this will kill you bucket, and maybe you don't encounter it for another 10 years, but there's some kind of environmental stimuli that resembles That
Mm,
thing that your nervous system put in the "this will kill you" bucket, what it'll do is your fight or flight response will initiate. You'll go into threat mode.
mm,
None of this is a conscious process. You don't wake up in the morning and decide that you want to have a panic attack in the middle of a target,
right.
right? It's your nervous system trying desperately to keep you alive because it thinks that the thing is dangerous. Yeah. Um, Take for example a young child. Let's age them at 1, right? I think most of us don't have a conscious memory of being 1. I know I don't. But if a child that young gets bitten by a dog, they are going to develop a lifelong fear of all dogs, not
Mhm,
just the dog that bit them, right? That goes into the bucket of things that will kill you. And until you come to see somebody like me, that's going to be a fear that you continue to have. What your nervous system learned is that dogs are dangerous. And so now all dogs fall into that category,
mm,
right? So sometimes it makes sense like that. Sometimes there's a direct line from point A to point B. Most times that's not how it works. Let's take the same child, 1 year old, this poor child that I've made up, and their parents take them out for breakfast, and they are outside. It's a beautiful Sunday, and they get pancakes, right? And they get maple syrup with their pancakes, and they get stung by a bee.
mm,
They may develop a lifelong aversion to maple syrup. Not
mhm,
because the maple syrup hurt them, but because it was part of that sensory stimuli
mhm,
of getting hurt by the bee, right?
right.
So
Mhm,
your goal, is this is what I tell my clients, your goal is not to figure out what's initiating your threat response. Your goal is to become really well acquainted with what's going on inside your body. Because I can tell you how to know when your threat response has initiated. It's muscle tension. It's the first thing your body does
mhm,
because you're preparing to fight or flight, right?
mm,
So if you do a quick body scan and take stock of where are your muscles tense right now, everybody watching can probably name at least one. But also, if you're watching this, you're not in life threatening danger. You're not about to die. So you don't actually need to have any tense muscles.
mhm,
It's not necessary. And so if you take 5, 10 seconds and do a body relaxation, do a quick body scan, and try to soften all of the muscles in your body, right? From head to toe, take 5 seconds.
mhm,
What that does is that interrupts your threat response. And it allows your nervous system to recognize that right now you are not in immediate life threatening danger.
mm,
And for my folks with extensive histories of trauma or really bad anxiety, they have to do that 200 times a day, if not more,
mm,
because we don't realize how much of our days we spend in like fight or flight mode. We don't realize how much our threat response is driving our day to day interactions until somebody like me comes along and points it out, right? And I say all of this not to make people feel bad about themselves. That's not what it is. You have a nervous system that's essentially working overtime,
mhm,
right? And going back to how everybody's experience is different, the things that initiate my threat response are different than what's going to initiate your threat response.
right.
I've never had a negative experience with a dog. I've never met a dog I didn't like, right? So I'm not going to go into panic mode over that. So don't feel like you're doing something wrong. Think about it as your nervous system working overtime. If you walked into a room where the air conditioner was set to 50 degrees, you would get goosebumps, right?
Mhm,
You wouldn't beat yourself up for getting goosebumps. The same thing that's happening, that's your sympathetic nervous system.
right.
So your sympathetic nervous system is responding to what's going on in your environment. I've done almost all of my training with Dr. Eric Gentry. He is amazing. And to quote him, what you're experiencing is an internal response to external stimuli. That's what's going on. You're not broken. You're not defective. And that's where our anxiety comes from. It's your nervous system thinking that you're going to die. But unless there's a bear in the room with you, you're not going to.
Yeah. You just explained everything just so well and so clearly that it all makes sense. Like using the examples that you used of, having some experience when you were younger that you may not remember exactly because it happened when you were so young, or your brain has just shut that part out. But when
Mm-hmm.
you come around, like you said, when you use the dog as an example, it's all dogs, whether it was a Chihuahua or a German Shepherd,
Or a
it's
Great
or
Dane,
a Great
right?
Dane,
Yeah,
or yeah, it's
sure.
all dogs. I don't like them. Like that's just how how it goes. But
Yeah,
yeah, that's and even the maple syrup
yeah,
analogy that you use, that's like you relate that to that whole experience as a whole, and it's just like okay, or,
yeah,
or even the pancakes. I'm not eating pancakes because I got stung by a bee the last
yeah,
time I ate pancakes.
exactly. Yep, bad things happen.
Right.
That's in the bucket of things that kill me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow. So, can you share with us any resources that may be helpful for those who are watching or listening, who may have experienced either are diagnosed with anxiety or have anxious moments where they, anything that could be helpful for them?
sure. So, a few different things come to mind. First of all, if you have reached the point of what you feel is clinically significant distress, if it is bothering you more days than not, and it's really impacting your quality of life in a negative way, it's probably time to seek out professional help.
Hmm.
I really like therapyden.com. So oh, excuse me, it's the word therapy and the word den, den.com.
Hmm.
Therapyden.com is a fantastic search engine available in 50 states, and you can search by are you seeing folks in person? Are you in network with Aetna? Are you a non-binary therapist? Like you can search by all those different parameters, and it's free. You don't have to pay anything to use it. And as a therapist, I don't have to pay anything to be on the site, which is nice. And it gives you a lot of space to be able to really, as a therapist, I'm saying, to really be able to write out a good description of yourself. So therapyden.com, great, fantastic resource. Check to see if your company offers an EAP. A lot of larger companies will offer an employee assistance program, in which case you may get some therapy sessions for free.
Hmm.
Some companies will offer four, some companies go all the way up to 12. And I already know what you're going to say next, which is, but I don't want my employer knowing that I'm seeing a therapist. And it is actually illegal for us to tell your employer that you are seeing a therapist. The same HIPAA laws that you get the copy of every year at your doctor's office, therapists are bound by those same HIPAA laws. We can only break confidentiality if we are worried for your safety, if we are worried that you may hurt somebody else, or if you tell us about child abuse, abuse of an elderly person, or abuse of a disabled adult. Otherwise, we are bound by confidentiality laws. So, EAP is another really great place to get started. Like I said, there is mental health TikTok, and I do think that there is some valuable information on there. If you're going to use TikTok as a resource, just know who your source is, right? So a really great thing to know is that my information is publicly available because my licenses are issued by the state. In Florida, it's the Department of Health, right? So you can
Hmm.
search my name on the Florida Department of Health website, and it will pull up my license number. That is publicly available information. So if you hear something from somebody on TikTok claiming something and you're like, I'm not quite sure, search their license number. It
Hmm.
should be available, readily on the state website that they are. So just take some things with a grain of salt is what I'm saying. Not
Mhm.
everything that you see is necessarily going to be true. Um, and another really, really, well, I could go on, but The Body Keeps the Score is a really, really great book. It is written by Dr. Vanderkolk. He has spent his entire career researching how we continue to hold on to traumas in our nervous system. Remember, you're not broken, and how that impacts us present day on an unconscious level. So it's a great read. The Body Keeps the Score. I recommend that to everybody that I work with. Another great, fantastic tool is the ACEs. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Quick Google search will pull up those 10 questions for you. It is a 10-question assessment that asks about different areas of trauma, abuse, or neglect that you might have experienced before the age of 18. And it's a really good way of gaining some insight into yourself, because what we know, because there's been so much research done in the field of trauma, is the higher your ACEs score is, the likelier it is that you are going to experience depression,
Mm.
anxiety, PTSD, that kind of thing. Not because you're broken, but because it continues to live on in your nervous system. So it's kind of a foundational knowledge point to know about yourself,
Mhm.
because many times when folks come to me, if you grew up in a household where there was a lot of trauma, maybe you had a parent that was using substances, maybe you witnessed domestic violence on a regular basis, maybe you were physically abused, right? When you grow up in a household like that, that becomes your normal. You don't know that there's another way to be,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And so you will convince yourself that it wasn't that bad. I mean, don't other people have it worse? Yeah. And so what we do is we invalidate our own experiences, but I promise you it's continuing to live on in your nervous system. And so it's a point of knowledge to have about yourself that can really help to um, just hopefully normalize that it's okay to seek help, but also validate that what happened to you is not normal, and
Mhm.
most kids don't grow up that way, and it's impacting you present day, because how could it not?
Right.
So those would be my things.
Yeah. Thank you. I had a conversation with someone on the podcast a couple of weeks ago who also recommended The Body Keeps the Score as a book to read. So,
Yep,
and
yep,
I've seen a few things about it since then. I
yeah,
definitely plan on reading it, adding it to my list for this year of
yeah, yeah.
books that I plan to read. And I have one final question for you. Told
Sure,
you, I told you in the email I would have like a last question that it wouldn't be too intense or anything like that. Um,
sure,
just to break up the conversation a little bit.
sure.
So the last question I have is, if you had to eat one meal for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Oh, I could only choose one. The
Yes.
first thing that comes to mind is pasta. I love
Yeah.
pasta. So, and I feel like pasta is a broad enough category that I could have like ravioli one night and lasagna another night and
Yeah.
baked ziti another night,
Yeah,
and
switch it
so
up.
it would be pasta. It
Yeah.
would be pasta for sure. Yeah,
Great
yeah.
answer.
Um, I actually just thought of another resource that I want to make sure I mention.
Uh-huh.
So I briefly mentioned Dr. Eric Gentry. If you're interested in him, 1000% recommend. Gentry. He has a tool or a video on YouTube called Tools for Hope,
Mm.
done by his colleague Jenny Brackman. It's about 40 minutes, and she does a fantastic job of kind of condensing down his research,
Mm.
and also goes into some really good coping skills, like that body scan that we did. She has that in her video. So it's Tools for Hope, done by Jenny Brackman. So I just wanted to throw
Great.
that out there because it occurred to me after I stopped talking about resources, but
Yeah. Yeah,
readily
no problem.
available on YouTube.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to have this discussion with me. It really is. Again, I said it before. It's really important to have these conversations about mental health and anxiety again because of what we've all been experiencing over the last few years, and it's really important to know your body, and I love the body scan idea and
Mhm,
the five senses. That's a great thing. I've heard that
mhm.
before. So that's a really great thing to kind of shake your brain up a little bit to get out of
Yep,
that thought pattern of the anxiety and the
exactly.
anxious thoughts. So
Yep.
thank you so much, Natasha, for
Thank you
yeah, for
too.
being here today. I'm really happy that we have connected, and look forward to sharing this episode with everyone.
Thank you so much. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. Yeah. This concludes this episode of the Our View podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on all social media platforms at Our View for Life. That's OurView, the number 4, LIFE. If you have a topic or a person, or if you are a person who would like to be interviewed for an upcoming episode of the podcast, send us a DM on Instagram, send us a message on Facebook, or you can email me at ourviewforlife@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.